So here we are today in health class, taking a look at diseases of the past and of the present. So you might initially say, okay, this is going to be sad and depressing. Well, some of the things we're going to discuss are kind of dark, but really kind of fascinating as well, because we're going to be talking about the human body's amazing ability to survive under very intense conditions. So we're going to start today by drifting back into the past, and we're going to go all the way back to the Dark Ages, a time in history where there was absolute misery throughout the world. They called them the Dark Ages because many people actually believed that the world was in fact coming to an end. But luckily, this wasn't true, and many of the problems that they were facing were brought on by themselves. The Dark Ages were actually the first few centuries of the Middle Ages, a time following the collapse of the Roman Empire. And as we know, the Romans had very strict social and societal rules to live by. Everyone knew their place. But the Dark Ages were exactly the opposite of this. No more structure in education, no more political structure, and it was kind of an every person for themselves type atmosphere. And it brought about a lot of interesting beliefs and behaviors that ended up causing some very serious health problems. So during the Dark Ages, there was kind of a void of power. And what ended up happening was the church members and leaders of the church steadily rose to the top of society because they still valued education. And within the confines of their churches, they still held classes and taught the Bible. So they became some of the smarter people around. So they were looked up to and eventually began to set some of the standards and rules of society to live by, with good intention. But some of those rules created some health problems. So one of the rules, laws, or expectations of the time was that you kept your flesh, your skin covered whenever in public. They believed that it was immoral to go around in public showing your skin. Thus, the long robes with the baggy sleeves and the hoods, Grim Reaper style, kept everyone covered and safe for the moral law. But the church also believed that it was not right to clean your body. Can you imagine going your whole life without ever taking a bath or a shower? Many people did during this time. They believed that if you cleaned your body, you were allowing a chance for the evil spirits of the world to penetrate your skin. And they also believed that you were trying to be possibly attractive to the opposite sex, which was against moral law. So this covering of the body and not cleaning it allowed certain disease situations to occur. Humans had as many fleas as dogs or cats would during this time. And you couple that with their bathroom habits or lack thereof, it was very common for people to just go to the bathroom wherever they felt like it, walking down the streets. And this obviously created some sanitation situations as well and contributed to the really serious spread of disease. We'll get more into the bathroom situation here in just a little while. Now, this lack of personal hygiene and overall cleanliness and messiness of society with garbage and human feces and urine laying around, you can only imagine that the disease outbreaks began to happen. And some of the worst disease outbreaks ever to happen in world history occurred during this time. For instance, the Great Black Plague, or bubonic plague that you may have heard of. Also, cholera and leprosy were diseases that they had to contend with. Now, you may or may not know that the Great Black Plague was actually linked to rats, and specifically the fleas on the rats. Because with all the garbage around and human feces, the rat population exploded, and they were spreading their fleas all around in the human population. And without people washing their bodies and walking around with their wool clothing, It was the perfect storm for a major disease outbreak. Now, as disturbing as this next picture may be, you need to understand this was the reality that the people had to live with during the Dark Ages. The disease was called the Black Death because a flea living under a person's cloak would bite them, and fleas actually vomit what's in their stomach into whatever it is they're biting, thus spreading the bacteria that causes the Black Death. It causes the blood vessels under the skin to rupture, so there's bleeding under the skin, and eventually the blood dries and turns black, and thus the term Black Death. This could happen anywhere on the human body and eventually could spread throughout most of the body. A person could be perfectly healthy one day, and within 48 hours, they could be gone from this disease. Having your skin blackened from this disease was just one of the many symptoms. Other symptoms include nausea, vomiting, very high fever, and largely swollen lymph nodes, which are glands in your neck, under your armpits, and in your groin area. These glands would oftentimes swell to the size of a golf ball. They were extremely painful, and at the time, they were called buboes. And many believe the term having a boo-boo actually came from the Dark Ages and these large sores on the body. Many people are unaware of the fact that the very happy-go-lucky nursery rhyme song, Ring Around the Rosie, actually originated in the Dark Ages and specifically was sung regarding the Great Black Death or the bubonic plague. Think about the words, ring around the rosy. What people would do is form a circle and hold hands in a prayer circle, and they would move around the rosary beads that would be placed in the middle of the circle. They also believed at the time that certain flowers had magical medical qualities, and they believed the posy flower was especially powerful, and they would often fill their pockets with the petals of the posy. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down refers to the fact that so many people were dying so quickly with this disease that they could not bury them all, and they had to resort to burning the bodies in the center of the city. So the Great Black Plague was not the only disease causing problems during the Dark Ages. There was also a disease known as cholera. Cholera is spread through the contamination of drinking water, and mostly because of human feces getting mixed in with the drinking water. Cholera would kill its victims by giving you severe diarrhea and vomiting. Now, we all have those afflictions from time to time, but I'm talking about having it so severe that you cannot survive. Again, this disease also was linked to their dirty lifestyle, going to the bathroom wherever they felt like it, leaving behind feces and urine to seep into their drinking water wells. Very easy to see how this disease could take over. Many, many people were debilitated by this disease. It actually helped to shape the world map the way we see it today, because cholera ended up killing hundreds of thousands of soldiers that were waiting to overtake cities and countries. So even in our modern times, cholera can rear its ugly head. If we get into a flooding situation where a lot of water seeps into wells, it can bring the cholera bacteria up to the surface, and then when the water levels drop, the cholera bacteria from one person's septic tank could end up in the well of their neighbors. Now, another one of those dangerous diseases of the Dark Ages that could have been prevented if they had cleaned their bodies more frequently was the disease called leprosy. There is no pleasant way to describe what leprosy does to the human body. It's an infection that starts out on the skin, and because their bodies weren't cleaned, can eventually get into wounds and cuts and scrapes and penetrate under the skin, causing severe damage to the connective tissue, the muscles, and the skin. What this would result in was people having their fingers fall off, their hands fall off, in some cases entire arms, and toes, and feet, and even ears. This was a nasty disease that was quite preventable, and it is still with us today in certain conditions in certain countries. Now, if you were terribly unfortunate and picked up this disease, leprosy, during the Dark Ages, your social life was now over. In fact, many communities would declare you civilly dead. You were alive, but you lost all of your civilian rights to communicate and interact with other human beings. Even if you survived the disease, oftentimes they would make you wear a cowbell around your neck to warn anyone in town that a leper was coming out of the alleyway or onto the sidewalk. But many people were forced to move into what were called leper colonies, little small towns where hundreds and hundreds of people were forced to go live out the rest of their days or see if they can survive the disease. Some were even put on ships and put out to sea with no captain to guide them. Now, as mentioned earlier, their bathroom habits were quite crude compared to today's standards. But many of the mistakes that they made in the Dark Ages are the reason why we have setups like we do today, with flushing toilets and leach fields and such. But what happened was they eventually made a connection between their lifestyle and the diseases that they were catching. So they became a little bit more civilized, if you will, and they started to create containers to go to the bathroom in. Eventually, many of these containers were called privy boxes. Perhaps you've heard a grandparent say, "Yeah, when I was a kid, I had to go to the privy to go to the bathroom." Well, the term came from the Dark Ages. But these containers varied based on where you lived. For some people, it was a true privy box with a lid. For others, it was a chair-like box that you could sit down with armrests. For others, it was more like a bucket. But it served to help contain the situation for a while, but you still had the issue of what do you do when the box or the bucket is full? And they would take this container out into their front yard and dump it in the yard, of course, infecting their drinking water supply. So cholera and diseases like that were still a major problem as a result of it. In the cities, it became a huge issue, because if you lived in the upper floors of an apartment building and your privy box was full, your only option was to take it to the window and dump it out. Now I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute. What if people were walking down below? This was common to have happen. It was common for people to be walking along and have the contents of a privy box land right on top of their heads. So as the populations of the cities became larger and larger, this dumping of the waste became a real issue for many people. There was so much feces and urine on the sidewalks, it was difficult for people to walk through it. So one of the solutions they came up with was to organize when people dumped their privy boxes. One option was to only dump your privy box when you heard the ringing of the church bells, which would happen a couple times a day. So this option helped a little bit in regards to at least warning people when the boxes were going to be dumped, but this meant that everyone was now dumping at the same time, and massive amounts of human feces and urine were now hitting the streets. So they went to the other option, and this was called the Gardy-Loo law. So what was required was you could dump your box anytime you liked, but when you hung out your window, you had to scream, "Gardy-Loo!" before dumping your box. And of course, it means, on your guard, here comes the toilet. Hey, get out of the way. Crap coming. Gardy-Loo. So this dumping of the privy boxes went on for many hundreds of years, until a gentleman by the name of T.J. Crapper came along and invented the flushing toilet. So now that we've covered the bathroom situation adequately, let's take a look at what the doctors were up to during the Dark Ages. This picture that you're looking at now is how a typical doctor would have presented themselves to you before performing an examination on you in the Dark Ages. So the long robe and the hat and the beak-like mask that covered their face. And of course the examination stick that they would use to poke at you. The beak-like mask, very similar to a gas mask of modern times. The beak was often filled with herbs and spices that were designed to filter out any of the diseases that they may have possibly picked up from their patient. Something else to remember that during the Dark Ages, other than alcohol, there really wasn't anything else for anesthesia to knock people out when doing surgery. So oftentimes doctors would hire some of the biggest, strongest men in town as holders to hold their patients still while they cut into their bodies. Again, no anesthesia meant a lot of pain. Now, have you ever had stitches? Well, if you did, you had the more modern method involving a little hooked needle and some actual stitching thread. That's another story altogether. But during the Dark Ages and before, it was very common for doctors to actually use leaf cutter ants to stitch the human body. The ants have very powerful jaws, and they would like to suck the blood from the wounds. So the doctors would pour dozens of them on the wound, and the ants would line up, locking their jaws into your flesh and sucking the blood. Then the doctors would simply snip off the bodies and leave the heads until the wound was healed. Hey, let's take a break for a minute. As much as I love talking about the Dark Ages, strange laws, no bathing, no cleaning, rats, fleas, the Black Death, buboes, ring around the rosy, cholera, leprosy, privy boxes, Guardian, TJ Crapper, doctors with beaks, bloodletting, stitching with ants. Oh man. Good thing we survived those Dark Ages. But did you know that the Black Death, cholera, and leprosy are still with us today? Many people don't know that. But I think it's time for us to talk about some of the more modern diseases that we face. Let's do that. The first disease of the modern era that I would like to discuss with you is a disease called polio. Polio affects the nervous system and ultimately the muscular system of the human body, oftentimes paralyzing its victim. One of the most famous people who was diagnosed with polio was a former president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But luckily, scientists like Jonas Salk were working diligently to come up with a cure and a vaccine for this disease. And Jonas Salk eventually did crack the code. This major breakthrough made sure that young children would no longer be paralyzed with their legs and have to wear metal braces, and people would not have to be put into hyperbaric chambers to increase the oxygen supply in their bodies. Another disease of the modern era is called measles. Many of you have been vaccinated for this. The symptoms of measles are fever, dry cough, runny nose, sore throat, white spots inside the mouth, red rash spreading from the hairline downwards. This disease is quite contagious and usually will spread 4 days before the rash appears. Because it's not such great fun to have these vaccination injections, sometimes the doctors will combine several diseases together, like measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR shot. The disease mumps is a bit scary. It can start out with high fevers and aches and pains, but most commonly it shows up in the swollen salivary glands in the jaw and the neck. It can really be quite deforming. Now you're about to hear a young girl who has the illness known as whooping cough. You will easily be able to tell how it got its name. It makes its victims suffer, gasping for air. It is curable, but quite contagious, and is making a comeback these days because fewer and fewer people are getting vaccinated against it. Have you ever heard of the human papilloma virus? Well, many people have not. And that's strange because the human papilloma virus is the #1 sexually transmitted disease in the world today. To prevent the damage from this virus, which is notably cancer in the reproductive organs, and most notably cervical cancer in the female, a series of 3 shots are given to young teenagers. Research is starting to come in, and we are starting to see a dramatic reduction in the number of young adults who are developing cervical cancer, and it is directly linked to this vaccination. So when was the last time that you had your tetanus shot? Is it too long to remember? Well, ideally you're supposed to have your tetanus booster shot within a time span of every 5 to 10 years. Tetanus is a disease that's spread through the contact of dirty objects entering the body through a wound, such as a rusty nail, an old piece of metal, or a piece of glass. Although many teenagers complain that the tetanus shot hurts too much, believe me, it is nothing compared to what the disease of tetany can do to your body. Take, for instance, the example of this man in this oil painting from centuries past. He is suffering from full-blown tetanus. Think of the worst muscle cramp that you've ever had in just one of the muscles of your body and how badly that hurt. Now imagine that pain in virtually every muscle of your body. This would be an extreme case. There can be cases where it's not quite so severe. And in our modern times, we do have some treatments that lessen the pain. But tetanus is nothing to fool with. It can be fatal and can affect you for the rest of your life. So get that vaccination. Now it's time to talk about the most important muscle in the human body, which is, of course, the human heart. Did you know that your heart beats, on average, about 100,000 times a day and never stops to rest? If it did stop to rest, we'd be in very big trouble. But in our country, we tend to neglect this important muscle. We take it for granted. Heart disease is the #1 leading cause of death in the United States. One factor alone is a major contributor to this number, and that is smoking. Tobacco is responsible for over 400,000 deaths of Americans every single year. It's not just your heart that's damaged by the use of tobacco products such as cigarettes. Take a look at these lungs. The lungs to the right are healthy. They've been breathing in clear oxygen for all of their life. The smoker's lungs to the left are literally filled with black tar. The black tar plugs up the little alveoli sacs in the lungs, causing them to stick together. The lung tissue will then die due to lack of blood flow, thus leading to emphysema, or disappearing of the lungs. But cigarettes aren't the only factor to consider. You must also look at how do we handle stress? What about our eating habits and lack of physical exercise? All of these things can lead to a clogging of our arteries, also known as atherosclerosis, which can lead to blood clots, causing heart attacks or maybe even a stroke. The second leading cause of death in the United States is cancer. Cancer is just simply the abnormal growth of cells in the body. It actually is a normal thing. It happens to us quite frequently. But if our immune system is healthy, it's discovered early and destroyed, and we never even knew that there was the beginnings of a problem. But when we weaken our bodies through smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, and just general abuse of the body, we offer these cancer cells the opportunity to gain a foothold and take over. So though it's true cancer can happen to us at any time in our lives, we dramatically reduce the chances of it occurring by eliminating all the risk factors that we've mentioned so far. The next disease to spend a little time discussing is known as AIDS, or Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. Our education efforts have been working. In the past couple of years, the number of new cases of AIDS in the United States has dropped approximately 19%. But we still have 1.2 million people living with this disease in our country. AIDS is still a crisis, but I believe that we've been taking it for granted lately, and we need to talk about it a bit more. Many people in the United States and around the world have the belief that HIV and AIDS are the same thing, and they are not. They are actually different stages of the process of the disease. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. HIV is the virus that could eventually lead to AIDS. A person can be infected with the HIV virus and carry it for many years and not have any symptoms. In this case, they would be HIV positive. It becomes AIDS when the symptoms start to show. And the symptoms of AIDS are not fun at all. The symptoms of AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, could literally be the symptoms of dozens of diseases happening to you all at the same time. Because HIV and AIDS doesn't actually kill a person. HIV simply takes out the human immune system and allows simple everyday infections to get in and take over. The immune system literally is shut off. So the HIV virus, or human immunodeficiency virus, is very opportunistic. We've never faced a virus like this in all of human history before. Usually we can use our immune system to create vaccinations that eventually weaken the enemy and we build our resistance to them. But this virus is different. This virus uses our immune system to its benefit. For example, an HIV virus feeds off one specific host cell in the human body, and that cell is known as the helper T cell. The helper T cell is the general or commander of the troops of your immune system. That's right, you do have soldiers within you. You have commanders, you have combat specialists, you have communications officers, surveillance officers. You even have peacemakers and cells that clean up the mess after your body has been at war. So basically what occurs is the immune system discovers the HIV virus, literally gives it a free ride to the helper T cell. Once the helper T cell wraps around the HIV and begins to study it and try to figure out how to destroy it, that's the moment that the HIV virus takes over. It surges inside the helper T cell, takes over his reproductive system, and makes copies of itself until the helper T cell explodes and dies. Literally hundreds and hundreds of HIV come out of the helper T cell. They all each go out and find their new helper T cell and do the same thing. Eventually, enough helper T cells are taken down, so the immune system shuts off. None of the other soldiers of the immune system will do anything unless told to by the helper T cell. And if the commanders aren't there, it's all over. Hey, are you guys still out there? Wow. I hope so. You've had a lot of information thrown your way today. You know, if you think about it, these little things, viruses, bacteria, they're much like little ghosts that are living amongst us. But we cannot forget that they're there. Did you know that there are as many bacteria on the palm of your hand as there are humans on the face of the earth? That's quite impressive. So I hope that this iMovie has given you enough information that you'll be able to go on and live a long, healthy life. Don't forget, the simplest things can prevent the biggest problems. Take that shower once in a while. Wash your hands a few times a day. Take good care of your body and keep your immune system strong. Let those soldiers do what they're supposed to do. And with that, I'll say goodbye and see you soon.